Good afternoon. I'm Ruthi Rajan, Deputy Editor of the Oath Legal Magazine. Thank you for joining the Oath webinar series. This morning, our webinar is in association with the law firm Charles Russell Speechlys. The topic we're covering today, as you can see on the screen, is the direction of travel for hotels and hospitality 2.0. Where are we now? Our speakers, Simon Green and Reem Al-Mahrous, will talk about the key and current legal trends in the hotels and hospitality sector and analyze from their own experience what changes to the main form of hotel agreements have actually materialized, and if there are any specific changes or specific areas of focus in relation to the direction of travel going forward. I'd like to introduce both our speakers briefly. Simon is a partner at Charles Russell Speechlys and head of real estate and hotels and hospitality across the Middle East and Asia. Reem is a senior associate at the firm and leads the real estate and hotels and hospitality team in Bahrain. Together, Simon and Reem have extensive experience advising on hotel and hospitality matters in the Middle East and internationally. Simon and Reem will lead the session for the first half, and this will be followed by a question and answer session. There will be some poll questions posed to you over the course of the webinar. The question will appear on your screen. We request you to participate in the polls, and after you've answered the question, kindly click on the submit button to respond. There's also an option on the right side of your panel on both the laptop and the phone to type in your queries. As it's a session that's scheduled for an hour, we request you to send in queries that are relevant to our discussion today. Over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruthie, for that kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining in from around the world. What's important, though, is that we are delighted that you are joining. I'm conscious of time, so I will dive straight into the presentation, if that's okay. Next slide, please. Before we start to talk about the direction of travel for hotels and hospitality 2.0, I wanted to take a few minutes to introduce our firm and our hotels and hospitality practice. We are an international law firm with around 170 partners and over 500 lawyers. We have offices in the UK, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. In relation to the region, we have 3 offices: Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. Reem is based in Bahrain, and I split my time between the Middle East and Asia. I think the infographics on the slide provides a very useful summary of information around our regional capabilities. Next slide, please. In terms of our hotels and hospitality practice, I lead the regional team and I co-head our global hotels practice. We started doing hotel and hospitality work about 7 or 8 years ago in the region, and since then we've been involved in over 50 transactions. And as you can see from the slide, we have worked on hotel transactions involving some of the world's best known operators. Our sweet spot is probably acting for owners, but we do act for several operators, and I will be interested to see the results of our upcoming poll in this regard. As you can see from the slide, working in the hotel sector is more than just advising on operating contracts, though this is a key part of what we do. It also involves other services as referred to on the slide. Next slide, please. Back in October 2020, which now seems like an aeon ago, we held a webinar with the Oath entitled "The Direction of Travel: Time to Re-examine the Hotel Management Agreement." It was during the height of the pandemic, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the sector, and rightly so. In that webinar, we considered the impact of COVID-19 on key provisions of a hotel management agreement and explored emerging and potential trends across various commercial and legal terms. In today's webinar, we intend to briefly provide a recap over the last few years in relation to what we have seen and to share our team's experience. We want to reassess some of the provisions we discussed in 2020 to consider whether those anticipated trends actually materialized. And we want to relay some other sector trends that we are now seeing as part of the direction of travel for the industry. As Ruthie has mentioned, we have some time allocated for questions and answers, and we are looking forward to answering your questions then. And finally, I think the slides are going to be distributed to everyone after the event. Next slide, please. So before I go on further, I think it would be great to understand a bit more about our audience today. Therefore, if you could let us know which part of the industry you are involved with, that would be much appreciated. And so if I could now ask the Oath team to commence the interactive survey. Okay, that's interesting. We've got a good mix of stakeholders. I'm interested to know what the other is. Maybe developers, investors. But yeah, that's good to know. So thank you, everyone. Next slide, please. Next slide again, if you don't mind. Great. So we've witnessed some of the most significant changes to the industry over the last 2 years. The travel sector, including hotels and hospitality, has been one of the most heavily impacted sectors as a consequence of the pandemic. There was a global disruption to the travel industry, including border restrictions and reduced flight operations, which limited people's ability to move freely. We experienced multiple lockdowns, resulting in partial or full closure of hotels, as well as F&B outlets. Many corporations applied a working from home policy and restricted or discouraged business travel, and we learned to adapt to virtual meetings, events, and conferences, just like this one. We saw hotels being repurposed for other uses, including quarantine hotels. There were complete overhauls to hotel operating policies, including health and safety. And I would add that whilst it feels like we have come through the worst of the pandemic, parts of the world, particularly in Asia, are still being severely affected. Next slide, please. Our international hotels and hospitality team have been incredibly busy over the last 2 years. Some of the main areas that we have been involved with and anticipate to continue to be involved with include force majeure. So we went through a detailed analysis of force majeure provisions in a number of hotel agreements to assess whether these provisions could and should be enforced. Suspending, extending agreements. We negotiated suspensions to certain obligations in hotel agreements and agreed extensions to key dates in relation to the construction of hotels as a result of market conditions. New developments. Notwithstanding the impact of the pandemic has had on the hotel and hospitality industry, investment in this area continued, and we were fortunate to be involved in some exciting new projects. The deflagging of hotels. We've been involved in the deflagging of a major hotel in the region, which interestingly continues to be managed by an international operator, but without their brand attached to it. So essentially a TPO or third-party operator model. We anticipate that this form of structure will be more popular as the hotels in the region continue to mature. Renegotiating agreements. We have renegotiated certain terms of existing hotel agreements prior to their renewal to include more current and mutually beneficial provisions. And finally, alternative structures. There's been a steady increase in the alternative models, particularly the franchise model. We discussed these in more detail in our previous seminars with the Oath back in 2019 and 2020. However, our experience to date is that the preferred operating structure in the Middle East continues to be the traditional model, i.e. the full management structure. Next slide, please. So I'll now take this opportunity to hand over to my colleague Reem, who will take you through to the end of the presentation and who actually gets to walk you through the really interesting stuff. Over to you, Reem.
Thank you, Simon. So we tend to focus on hotel management agreements today. As Simon mentioned, they continue to be the most common form of operating agreement that we see in the market. Although hotel management agreements are optically structured differently, they broadly contain the same type of provisions, and those include the ones set out on the slide. HMAs are usually accompanied by a technical services agreement, which addresses the design and development stage of a hotel, as well as an intellectual property license agreement. And although some of those terms are often enshrined within an HMA. So although each HMA, although there are a number of provisions that we could go through and a number of very relevant changes, we intend to focus on the provisions that are highlighted in blue on the slide. Those are 1, fees and payments, 2, budgets, accounts and controls, and 3, performance tests. We'd be happy to discuss any of the other ones with you, so do get in touch with either Simon or I. Our details are set out at the end of the slide deck. Next slide, please. It's important to stress that HMAs are very bespoke agreements and are heavily negotiated. They are influenced by a number of factors. So those include bargaining powers of the parties, the nature of the asset itself and whether there's a brand attached to it or a lack of a brand, and also the location of the hotel and the current and projected market conditions for it. So we intend to focus on our own team's experiences. We appreciate that hotel agreements can be very varied and different. We appreciate as well that your experience may be different, and we'd love to hear about your experience in that regard. So like Ruthie mentioned, we've included a couple of survey questions over the next few slides. Don't worry, they're not any pop quiz, and the responses will remain anonymous. Next slide, please. So starting off with fees and payments, an operator will usually be entitled to 4 main types of fees. That's a base fee, incentive fee, group services, or system fees, is often referred to, and technical services fees. We've included the usual fees that we experienced on the slide. Generally speaking, we've seen that the level and structure of fees in hotel management agreements over the past 20 years or so have evolved, and there's now further alignment between risk and reward. Next slide, please. So where are we now? We anticipated that there would be further alignment between risk and reward. So for example, base fees would reduce further and incentive fees would increase in order to encourage operators to manage hotels with more commercial efficiency. In our recent experience, the commercial terms of hotel agreements have been quite varied, but generally speaking, they still fall within the percentages that were set out in our earlier slide. We do hope that as the market recovers, we'll continue to see further alignment and potentially some more creative fee structures, such as base fees increasing over a period of time. In terms of the second point, there was an expectation that owners would seek to hedge risk against an uncertain market and request a more fixed payment or return. These could be in the form of an owner's priority or fee caps. In our experience, we haven't really come across these in the Middle East recently, but they have materialized in other jurisdictions that our team operates in, such as the UK. Interestingly, what we have seen in this market has been the opposite. So around 30% of management agreements that we've been involved with have included a minimum management fee in favor of the operator. This entitles an operator to receive a fixed payment irrespective of the performance of the hotel. We didn't see these pre-pandemic and initially thought they were quite unusual, but perhaps it's a direct reflection of operators taking a more risk-averse approach to the market. We think that fixed returns is going to still be a topic of conversation going forward. And from a drafting perspective, it's important to consider whether there are any exclusions that apply to these payments, and also if there are any clawbacks involved. In terms of the final point, we also anticipated that there would be further scrutiny by owners in relation to ancillary and group fees, as a result of operators, operating companies restructuring and consolidating, but also that the markets became more localized. In our experience, we have seen a number of operators who have been willing to apportion a part of these payments to directly benefit a hotel or the region in which it operates in, but we can't say that this is now a common term. Next slide, please. And if Ruth, you could start the survey question. So In your experience, have operators become more risk averse or willing to share more risk? Yeah, that's interesting, and definitely probably something I agree with, especially in certain markets. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of budgets, accounts, and controls, HMAs will usually include detailed provisions in relation to the various budgets, the accounts, controls, and also owners' obligations to fund. We've set out some of the main provisions that we'd see, or main terms that we'd see in these agreements. Typically, an operator will want to have more autonomy over the fees and the expenses, and in order to facilitate their ability to manage a hotel in accordance with their brand standards or requirements. Owners, however, will naturally want to have more control and visibility over expenditure, and will try to negotiate these into an HMA. A good HMA will have a balance between the interests of both parties, and we can achieve these in many ways, including defining the circumstances where an operator can diverge from a budget without the owner's approval, or including freeze periods in relation to additional capital expenditure. Next slide, please. So in terms of where we were, we anticipated that owners would want to have additional controls in relation to allocating and controlling expenditure. And generally speaking, in the HMAs that we've been involved in, we think that they now provide for a more collaborative process. In addition to rights to scrutinize and input on budgets and expenditure, we've also seen the inclusion of in-country value clauses. And what these do is require operators to purchase goods and services from local suppliers. Of course, if possible, and if in accordance with their brand standards. I quite like these because it's a great way to encourage a local economy and support it, especially in these type of markets, and also support ESG, so environmental and social governance policies. So in terms of the second point, a particular lesson learned from COVID-19 has been the need for parties to come back to the table and reconsider agreed budgets. And particularly in certain circumstances, such as force majeure or changes in law, as these circumstances tend to be carved out of any restrictions on an operator in terms of their ability to diverge from the budget. Having the right to require that budgets are reassessed is a useful mechanism to control budgets and expenditure and have more visibility and certainty. finally, in terms of the last point, we anticipated that that at the very least, owners would want to have the right to utilize funds in existing accounts in certain circumstances, again, such as force majeure or emergencies, particularly where these funds are required at short notice. We'd probably say that nearly all of the HMAs that we've been involved with have included these type of provisions, but they are always subject to controls, such as the requirement by the owner to reimburse that fund within a defined period of time. Next question, please, and if you could please start the next survey question. So, have you experienced a similar experience to ours in relation to budgets, accounts, and controls? Okay, that's good to see. So next slide, please. Thank you. So moving on to our final point, the majority of HMAs that we've advised on in the Middle East have included a performance test. These would provide an owner with the right to terminate an HMA if the hotel performance fails to meet a certain test. Traditionally, the performance test would require an operator to fail 2 tests within a defined period of time. These tests have traditionally been linked to the revenue per available room, so RevPAR, and also the gross operating profit. We've set out the typical terms and thresholds that we've come across on the slide. A performance test will usually be excluded from its application in certain circumstances, such as force majeure or major renovations to the hotel. Their performance tests are great to have, but in practice, they are quite difficult to enforce. Next slide, please. So in terms of the first point, like I mentioned earlier, I would say that almost every HMA that we have been involved with in the Middle East has included a performance test. They're generally quite common in the Middle East and perhaps less so in other regions. However, we did anticipate that owners would want to negotiate more meaningful performance tests. And those could either be in the form of a single or separate test, or if the dual test is still applied, to include more enforcement rights, or moving away from those metrics I mentioned earlier and evolving into newer, more applicable metrics. In our experience, certain operators have pushed back quite strongly on this and haven't really been willing to even consider a move away from the traditional test. However, they have been willing to consider and negotiate the thresholds, which is still a positive, positive thing. On the other hand, there have been operators that have been more willing and been more open to moving away from the traditional tests, and we have successfully managed to negotiate in both single tests in HMAs or separate tests in other HMAs. All of these tests have always included an element of gross operating profit to them. So we do think that performance tests is still going to be a point to consider in the future. Owners should be wary of the exclusion tests, of the exclusions to the tests that operators are continuing to try to negotiate in more detail, in part to try to ensure that they, if they are included, are materially impact the performance of the hotel. Whether or not an owner pushes for a more favorable performance test will also depend on the nature of the asset itself, and whether it's a unique concept, for example, and also the other provisions in the HMA. Next slide, please. And if you could please start the next poll. Has a performance test been successfully triggered in any of the HMAs that you've been involved with? Okay, very interesting. It would be great to hear from those who have successfully enforced it. So please do get in touch if you can. And next slide, please. So moving on to where we're heading towards and the direction of travel. The direction of travel for the industry and hotel agreements is heavily influenced by trends in the market. We've set out some of the trends that we're keeping an eye out for on the slide. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough time to go through all of them today, but perhaps we'll run through 2 or 3 with you. I don't think we can avoid talking about rising costs and supply chains. We've all experienced supply chain issues and rising costs as a result of the global pandemic, and these have only escalated in light of the recent war in Ukraine and surges to energy prices. These impact both owners and operators with regards to sourcing reliable materials and could increase costs and delays. This particularly may have an impact on hotels under development. Operators and owners should consider the terms of their HMAs and technical services agreements, because, for example, a technical services agreement will typically include some penalties where key milestones have been missed. An HMA, of course, could include quite wide rights for an operator to diverge from the budgets, and therefore there may be quite significant increases to expenditure. In terms of finance and financing, or the availability of finance, in the early pandemic days, we anticipated seeing a lot of foreclosures, and we thought there would be a steady stream of distressed assets coming onto the market. I think the general consensus has probably been that banks have worked very closely with owners to restructure and re-strategize their debt. As the market recovers, banks are reassessing their portfolios and will likely be more selective about the type of assets that they are lending and also the borrower's profile. We do anticipate to see higher loan-to-value ratios, LTV, and also lower debt service cover ratios. Owners should be wary of the terms of their HMAs, as these can often include restrictions in terms of lending, such as LTV caps, but also the type of lender that they can seek finance from. And perhaps one more, which is my favorite, sustainable and experiential travel. The demand for sustainable, immersive and experiential travel continues to increase, and it remains a key trend in the industry. We're seeing quite a lot of countries within the region, such as Saudi Arabia, really pushing the bar and paving the way forward in this space. And there are some truly unique concepts coming into the market over the next couple of years. Particularly some experiential travel concepts, such as these luxury tented developments, provide owners with the opportunity to develop and open hotels at a faster pace than they would for a traditional hotel. It also opens doors to other areas which may have previously been either inaccessible or unfeasible. So owners should, however, consider the structure of the management agreement and also the provisions, as they may include some enhanced obligations, such as commitment to sustainable development and operational practices, or they may impose certain suppliers on owners, and even include additional budgets and contributions, such as development, conservation, and social funds. So next slide, please. So if you could please start the final survey question. What trends do you think will have the most influence or significance in 2022 and 2023? We've had to remove alternative structures and financing from this list, but I think that's a given. Well, I'm glad to see that sustainable and experiential travel still is a significant portion of the trend that you expect to see. And I think we can move on to Q&A.
Thank you, Simon and Reem, for taking us through the session, and it was great to get that insight from those poll questions as well. We do have some questions that have come in, and I'd like to raise them with you, and one of you can answer based on the question. So the first one that has come in is, what will be the extent of technology in this quote unquote free to adopt technology era for hospitality?
Okay, well, the COVID-19 has really accelerated the investment and incorporation of technology into the industry. So we've seen this being used both in guest-facing and also back-office ways in order to enhance effective uses and also to address issues that came out of COVID-19. We do think that this is going to continue to be a continuing trend, and owners and operators will continue to invest in this area, particularly to address other challenges that may come up. So, for example, in the UK, we're experiencing shortages in terms of people who would want to work in the industry. So owners would likely need to invest in further technology in order to automate certain tasks, in order to mitigate this impact. However, in terms of the extent of how much the industry plans to adopt it, I think hospitality, its very core, is a very people-facing sector, and I personally don't think it'll ever evolve to a position where we're fully incorporating technology for everything. But then again, I might be wrong, and perhaps human interaction in the future may be considered a luxury.
Thank you, Reem. The next question is, HMAs for global operators versus HMAs for local or regional ones. What are the main areas of distinguishment under the ongoing changes?
So, broadly speaking, if the management structure is the same, so they're both a traditional management agreement, they should include very similar terms and conditions, like those that we set out in our earlier slide. However, there are some differences that could emerge. So, for example, central services or group services, international operators will tend to be part of a larger network, and may therefore have an extended kind of service offering. Of course, this will come at a price as well, so the fees that are requested may be higher. Also, in terms of brand standards, international operators will also tend to have quite robust brand standards that apply across multiple jurisdictions, and it can be quite rigid. That's not to say that regional or local operators don't have robust brand standards. In fact, they very well might do, and we do see them. But they might be more localized and might be catered for this market. And they may also be a bit more flexible in terms of the approach that they take towards them. A quite important one probably is the governing law and dispute resolution clause. So regional or local operators may want to apply the local law to the jurisdiction of the agreement, whilst international operators may opt for another jurisdiction, such as English law, which is actually the most common jurisdiction that we see in hotel management agreements in this region. And of course, there are a number of implications that come from this, especially when things go wrong.
I would
Thanks.
just
oh, sorry, Simon, go ahead, please.
Sorry, Ruthie, I was just going to add in and echo essentially what Reem was saying. we don't see a fundamental change in terms of the type of agreement used globally as opposed to regionally. But of course, and as Reem has mentioned, we do see localization of provisions within HMAs within the region. So the dispute resolution is definitely one of those. The ability to provide for a governing law which is local to the region as opposed to, say, English or on a more international perspective is definitely one of those that we see. There are other things which are kind of more localized provisions that need to take into account, local employment laws, visa requirements, indemnity provisions. I would also say perhaps SPV, incorporation of SPVs and licensing is another kind of key area that will differ based on kind of the where the agreement is being negotiated. So it's a very good question, but it's quite a large question, hard question to answer, because definitely there are lots of different provisions that we see in local regional HMAs as opposed to perhaps an HMA in the US or the UK, for example.
Thanks, Reem and Simon. The next question that has come in, does the length of a management agreement impact the fee structures?
Well, I think the duration of a hotel management agreement will be one of many factors that influence fees. So we spoke about some of them earlier as well, the bargaining power of the parties, the location, and the nature of the asset itself. But operators will likely factor in or take into account how much revenue they want to receive out of this asset over a certain period of time as part of their viability studies.
Absolutely agree with that. I would also perhaps just say it will also depend on, well, if you think about the average lifetime of a HMA being perhaps between 20 or maybe 15 years, 25 years, something along those lines with renewal rights. I think it's also going to be subject to, for example, whether the hotel is being developed or whether it's an existing built asset, because normally with the development of a hotel, you've got a period of time in which the hotel then starts to gear up and becomes effectively where the operator wants it to be in terms of its trading performance. I think you've also got other things to consider around financials, as Reem's mentioned, but including things like key money, whether the operator is actually providing any money towards the capex of the development of the hotel, or just to secure the operation itself. All of these things, in addition to the length of term, will always be taken into account in terms of the operator's fees.
Okay, so we have one final question. Can you elaborate on ways that an owner can seek to achieve more certain returns? Sorry, I hope my question was clear.
Yeah, it is. So there are many ways in which an owner can try and achieve more certain returns. So some of the most common have been an owner's priority, which is a slice of payment that an owner would receive either either expressed as a percentage or a fixed amount, and that would usually be paid to the owner after a base fee is paid to the operator, but before the operator is entitled to their incentive fee. Another way another method could be including fee caps. So restricting the level that an operator can receive and placing an upper limit. And that could also relate to an individual fee or collectively the fees that an operator would receive in a given year. More recently, we've also been seeing some more indirect ways at achieving that certainty or additional kind of levels of amounts. So, for example, what we've managed to negotiate recently has been a cap on the level of funds that can be in place in a FF&E, so the FF&E reserve at any given time. So in those circumstances, an owner's obligation to continue funding and depositing amounts into the FF&E reserve would no longer apply if that ceiling has been met. And and that's another way for owners to extract additional profit from the hotel.
Just one other thing I was going to mention, and we've mentioned it in the talk itself, is the rise of the alternative models, and another way in which you can provide greater certainty, particularly from an owner's perspective, is to consider alternative models. So not just the traditional HMA model. One of those being the lease model, for example. We have worked with a number of clients over the last few years where they were originally going to start off perhaps with the traditional model. And have moved more towards the lease model, so leasing the asset to the operator and effectively doing that for a guaranteed rent. It becomes a very passive play from the owner's perspective, but does provide certainty of return. That's the key benefits to that alternative model.
Thank you, Reem and Simon. We have some time for any closing comments if you have any, or we'll proceed to the conclusion.
No closing remarks from myself.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much to all those who attended. Thank you, Simon and Reem, for your practical insight on the topic. Several interesting takeaways for our attendees today on the sector and what we can expect to see over the next year. I know if we do have if you do have any further questions, please do reach out to them. Their details are out on the screen, or you can always send us the question and we'd be happy to forward it to the both of them to respond. Sincere thanks to the firm Charles Russell Speechlys for leading the discussion, to Emma Marsden at the firm. Thank you for your help in organizing this session. And also to my colleagues at Niche Publishers, especially to Sandhya Devakaran, co-organizer of this session. Thank you for your support this morning. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Oath Magazine's website. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I wish you all good health and a wonderful week. Thank you. God bless. Thanks, Reem and Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.